Yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back. Now, I got a few things to say. Firstly, I'm testing out this new mic. I just bought it online, so I don't know if it's gonna be good or not. So we'll just test it out, cause my house can get a little too loud sometimes. So I hope it doesn't take away from my sharing. And secondly, actually, there's no second thing that I want to say. I think that's the only thing I want to say. So today we'll be talking about exclusion clauses in contracts too, and this is the only topic or subtopic that I'll be talking about today. So hopefully it will be a short video lah. So exclusion clause. What is an exclusion clause? An exclusion clause excludes or limits a party's liability for breach of contract or negligence. So in a contract, there will always be one clause that is inserted by one party to the other party to exclude that one party from any liability, or at least limit the extent of liability that they have to deal with in the future. Okay. So this is found in standard form contracts. So standard form contracts is a contract that is standardized upon everyone that comes into contract with the company that issues that contract itself. Contoh I'm a company, I have a lot of customers. So for each one of the customer, I use the exact same contract that I use for diorang semua. I only use one form of contract. I don't vary, or um I don't change or alter the form of the contract to suit every customer. That is not a standard form contract. A standard form contract is one contract used for all customers that I are in business with. Macam tu. Okay. There are types of exclusion clauses. Firstly, exclusion clauses that limits liability on certain events or acts. Secondly, um, an exclusion clause that excludes or restricts liability that could amount to breach of contract. And thirdly, exclusion clauses that limit amount of damages should a breach occur. Okay, yang tu tak berapa penting. What's important in this subtopic is how we can determine if an exclusion clause is a valid one or an invalid one, so to say. So the first test that we use to determine whether or not an exclusion clause is valid or not is through its incorporation. How the exclusion clause is included into the contract. So generally, for someone to um, invoke this exclusion clause, they must first prove that that clause itself forms an integral part of the contract that they signed. Okay. Um, the exclusion clause can be incorporated by three ways. Firstly, by a signed document. Secondly, by a notice, which, or in other words, an unsigned document. Or thirdly, by a previous course of dealing. Okay. For for the first way of incorporation, which is by signed document, it is only applicable if the clause and contract itself is written and signed, and once it is signed, it is automatically binding. It is important to note that for signed document, not it is not relevant whether or not the signatories have read the exclusion clause or not. For example, if I enter into contract and that contract contains an exclusion clause, it is regardless of whether I read it or not. Once I have signed it, once I have signed it, I am bound by the exclusion clause walaupun saya tak baca. Okay? Um, this is seen in the case, okay, this type of incorporation by signed contract is seen in the case of Lestrange against Grocott, where in this case the plaintiff bought a cigarette machine, and the cigarette machine, when bought, he signed a contract, and then the cigarette machine broke. So in that contract that he signed, there was an exclusion clause that exempts any liability on the part of the defendant. So the defendant used this exclusion clause in their defenses, and the exclusion clause was a valid one because it was signed by the plaintiff himself. Okay. However, there are a few. Okay, one more. In the case of Subramaniam against Rednam, in this case, the plaintiff did not understand English, but that person, the plaintiff, entered into the contract nonetheless. So, the plaintiff basically did not have the capability to read and understand English. However, since the plaintiff signed that contract, he or she, I don't know the gender, they were bound by that contract regardless of whether or not they read or even understood English that was used in the contract. So it really shows that kalau kau dah sign document tu, kau tak kisahlah kau dah baca ke belum exclusion clause tu, once kau dah sign, kau dah bound by that exclusion clause as well. However, there are a few exceptions to the way of signed document as an incorporation of an exclusion clause. Firstly, a misrepresentation on the scope of the exclusion clause itself. This can be seen in the case of Curtis against Chemical Cleaning Co. So in this case, the plaintiff wanted to wash her wedding dress, and dia basically bagi dekat this one shop lah, which was Chemical Cleaning Co, the defendant. So the defendant, when they enter into a contract, which is the transaction, the contract, which was a signed document, stated that there were they should yeah. They are exempted from any liabilities from any damages howsoever cause, which means any damages dalam bentuk apa-apa saja pun, kalau dia adalah satu bentuk damage, then the defendant was exempted from any liability. That was in the written document. However, in the conversation, the worker in the defendant's shop, she said that she said something else basically, which contradicts the exclusion clause that was signed. So, in this case, the court held that an oral promise takes precedence or is more important or is put on a higher standard than written agreements. Okay. So in this case, the defendant kalah lah, sebab the defendant masa tengah bekerja tu, dia cakap something else which was not in the contract or contradicts the signed contract. Okay, macam tu. Secondly, the second exception is if the contract was signed under duress or undue influence. That's quite self-explanatory because there was no free consent. And thirdly is if the exclusion clause itself is an unreasonable one. And second and fourthly is non as factum. Non as factum is a Latin maxim that basically means not my deed or not my duty lah senang cerita. So this exception was created to protect the illiterate yang buta huruf and also the blind yang buta, because since they cannot see the contract, so to say, they are excluded from the exemption clause lah macam tu. So there are a few requirements for this exception to be used. Firstly, the signatory must be under permanent or temporary disability. Secondly, that person took all reasonable precaution to understood what he or she was signing into. And thirdly, there was a huge difference between what was signed and what the person thought they had signed. Okay, so there must be a huge difference there. Okay, we are done with signed documents. Now we're moving on to unsigned documents. The second way of how an exclusion clause is incorporated into a contract. So unsigned documents are basically in the form of tickets, vouchers, etc. Basically anything that is not signed by both parties. Okay, because if it was signed, then it goes under the first way of incorporation lah, basically. Okay. There are a few requirements for an unsigned document to work lah, basically. Firstly, it must be known to the buyer. The exclusion clause must be known to the buyer before or during the time the contract was made. Okay, this can be seen in the case of jap. Okay. The first requirement is it must be made known to the buyer before or during the time the contract was made, and the notice must be sufficiently broad. There they must the notice must be sufficiently brought to the attention of the other party. This can be seen in the case of Oli against Marlborough Court Limited. Marlborough Court is a hotel in which Oli, the plaintiff, stayed in. So, the exclusion clause was actually inside the hotel room, as opposed to it should be in the lobby lah senang cerita. It should be in the lobby. The exclusion clause should be in the lobby, but it was instead in the hotel room. And the exclusion clause basically exempted the defendants from any liability lah senang cerita. So the plaintiff suffered a few stolen items in their hotel room. However, since the exclusion clause, which was relied upon by the defendant, was actually inside the room instead of in the lobby, the exclusion clause itself cannot be used because the transaction or the contract was entered into by both parties at the lobby when the plaintiff made the purchase or made the payment for the hotel room. So the exclusion clause should at least come during the transaction when the transaction occurred and not after. Because when he reached the hotel room, the transaction was already over. It was already, the contract was already formed, so to say. Okay. Secondly, the the exclusion clause must be reasonably sufficiently communicated. Uh, Reasonably sufficiently communicated basically means that a reasonable person would read it. Macam it must come into the attention of a reasonable person. Macam tu. Okay, this can be seen in the case of Henderson and others against Stevenson, where it was where the exclusion clause was on the back of a ticket. Okay, tapi let's ask a question lah. What amounts to a sufficient notice? So we have defined reasonable. Now we have to define what amounts to a reasonable notice. So a reasonable notice is defined by the red hand rule. If you remember, I think a lot of us were alive at the time where at least we have seen pictures of a few tickets from the 1900s where there were small hands at the start of each term. Contoh, the first term ada this hand, and then the second term ada another small hand. That small hand usually would be in red, which implies that term or that point is important. So that is where the red hand rule was established. It basically means that the more outlandish or more pelik the exclusion clause is, the more attention should be given to that exclusion clause. Macam itulah. This can be seen in the case of Malaysia Airlines. I can't remember the full name of MES, but MES against Malini Nathan, where in that case, a 14-year-old boy, which was the defendant, missed his flight. And at the back of the defendant's ticket, it read that the changing of any timetables or any flight schedules is not on the responsibility of MES or something like that. Like I can't really remember, but it's along that lines lah. Macam tu. So the plaintiff, which was MES, relied on that exclusion clause and they basically won the case lah senang cerita. Okay. And thirdly, the exclusion clause. Sekejap. Okay, we also have a case of Parker against Southeastern Railway, in which the plaintiff received a paper ticket, and dekat paper ticket tu dia ada tulis see back, maksudnya macam tengok belakang lah, and at the back of the ticket there were exclusion clauses. So that is amounting to a reasonably sufficient communication of where the exclusion clause is. Okay, there are three requirements for, bukanlah three requirements, three jalan cerita lah for this that can happen. Firstly, if there is a writing and the person knows about the writing meaning exclusion clause lah. If it is written down on a ticket or a voucher and all that, and the person knows about the writing, that person is bound, and it also applies vice versa. If there was no writing and if the person did not know of any writing on the ticket or the voucher, then that person is not bound. However, if the ticket has writing and it is known by the person who holds that ticket, but that person is not sure whether the writing or the clause is binding or not, then the court will go back to the first question that we asked just now. Was it reasonably communicated? If yes, then he is bound. If no, then he is not bound. Macam itulah. Okay. Okay, that's it for unsigned documents. Thirdly is by previous course of dealing. Previous course of dealing deals with the day, bukan day to day, the interactions between parties. Okay, so in previous course of dealings, there must be a consistent previous course of dealing between parties. Maksudnya, if I am to contract this one company and I have been dealing with this one company for, let's say, 5 years, in the 5 years of me dealing with this company, there must be a consistent incorporation of the exclusion clause, or the practice between me and that company must be consistent. Consistent meaning macam every time every time I deal with this company, I am generally doing the same thing over and over again throughout my interactions with that company. Macam tu lah. So this can be seen in the case of McCutcheon against David McBrain. So in this case, there were 27 paragraphs that was included in the bukan ferry lobby, ferry ticket counter, and there was also sometimes uh, the need for customers to sign a contract. So, kan ada 27 paragraph. Paragraph tu ada dekat ferry counter masa nak beli tiket. And then sometimes, not all the time tau. Sometimes the customers who purchase the ticket also have to sign a document which contains the exclusion clause. So you see there's an inconsistency of how they deal with customers. Sometimes they ask the customers to sign a contract, sometimes they don't. So because of this inconsistency, the court held that there was no consistent previous course of dealing between the company and also their customers. Therefore, the exclusion clause is not valid based on that ground. Okay, macam tu. Um, okay. However, the exclusion clause could also be bound by trade usage or custom. This can be seen in the case of British Crane Hire against Ipswich Plant Hire, where basically a crane sank, and because in that industry, so to say, it was kind of a common practice for, I can't remember though. I'm sorry, I won't be explaining this case, but saya sendiri tak ingat sangat this case. But it's okay, we'll be moving on. Okay, we are finally done with incorporation, which is the first requirement to determine whether or not an exclusion clause is valid or invalid. The second requirement to determine whether or not it's valid or invalid is by interpretation. So we have established how an exclusion clause is valid based on how it was included in the contract. Now we will look at how courts interpret the exclusion clause itself. Okay, the general rule that courts adopt is only clear words exclude liability. That means that only clear words that are used in an exclusion clause makes that clause valid and also enforceable. And ambiguous terms are generally not accepted by courts. Okay, there are four main rules of interpretation. Firstly, a strict interpretation method. This this is where the court interprets that an exclusion clause is only valid if it covers the kind of liability that has arisen, which is also mentioned in the exclusion clause itself. So, in the case of Baldry against Marshall, the plaintiff wanted a a sport touring car, if I'm not mistaken, and he asked, basically, the plaintiff wanted a car that was durable and also suitable for outdoor use lah, senesta. The defendant, apa tu, he recommended a Bugatti. Bayangkan Bugatti nak pergi off road, what the hell. Okay, tapi the car was tiba-tiba, bukan tiba-tiba lah, the car was not suitable lah, obviously, for off-road touring. And in the purchase that was entered into by the plaintiff and the defendant, there was an exclusion clause that exempts any warranty on behalf of the defendant. However, warranty is not the same as condition. Condition is basically what the plaintiff wanted in the car that he was looking for, which was a car that was capable of off-road touring. That was the condition. That condition was not covered in the exclusion clause that the defendant gave to the plaintiff. So the court used a strict interpretation in saying that, okay, only this only this is covered in the exclusion clause, but your case is not covered in this clause, so it is not valid lah senang cerita. Okay. Secondly is the contra proferentum rule. Contra proferentum rule is usually used in ambiguous clauses and also ambiguous wording. Okay, this is where the exclusion clause is interpreted against the drafter of the clause itself, and is now relying on the clause that they had inserted into the contract. Okay, this rule is often used in ambiguous terms and is construed by the understanding of a reasonable man, which is basically to say that uh, okay, if there is an exclusion clause that a reasonable man would read, contohlah, two parties enter into contract A and B. This exclusion clause favors A more than B. Okay, and when a reasonable man reads this exclusion clause, he of course will think that, oh, this clause actually favors A over B. Therefore, that clause will be construed or interpreted against A. Maksudnya basically menentang A lah macam tu. The court will interpret it that way. Okay. So this is in the case of Elsa Creek Fishing Co against Malvern Fishing Co, which in that case the exclusion clause did not mention anything about negligence, which was the root cause of the cause of action that the plaintiff brought to the court. So, because it did not cover negligence, the court held that, okay, we use the contra preferentum rule. Since you are invoking negligence, but negligence was not in the exemption clause. The exemption clause was too wide, too general, and therefore it was ambiguous. We use the contra preferentum rule to interpret that clause against the defendants. Okay, macam tu. Thirdly is repugnancy. Repugnancy in basic terms is inconsistency. So in the case of J. Evans and Sons against Andrea Mazzarlo Limited, the court can strike out an exclusion clause which is inconsistent with the main purpose of the contract. So basically, this exclusion clause ni dia tersasar daripada the original aim of the contract lah sebenarnya cerita. So the court can strike out or can keluarkan the exclusion clause so that the main purpose of the contract itself is protected and also is upheld. Okay. Okay. Fourthly, negligence. For cases of negligence, very clear words are needed to actually exempt a party from negligence, as seen in the case of Premier Hotel against Tang Liang Sang. Okay, in this case, the plaintiff dia minta tolong defendant untuk pegang kunci bilik hotel dia. Dia kata, okay, I'll give you my keys. In a few minutes, I'll come back and I'll take the keys from you. Okay, macam tu. And then he went out. A few minutes later, someone who said that he is a representative of the plaintiff came to collect the keys. But in reality, that person is a nobody. He is a stranger. He is not related to the plaintiff in any way. So, since the defendant had the privilege, had the opportunity to see and also listen to what the plaintiff was actually saying to him, at the moment he passed his key to the defendant, basically he had been negligent in giving the keys away towards someone who is not related to the plaintiff pun, sebab pada awalnya the plaintiff tak cakap pun, oh saya akan bagi kunci, jap lagi ada orang lain akan ambilkan kunci tu untuk saya. He didn't say that. He said, I'll give you my keys, I will take the keys myself. So that was a case of negligence. But the exemption clause in the hotel that was provided by the hotel did not mention anything about negligence. So obviously the case crumbled down for the defendant. Okay. And actually that's about it. Adalah sikit lagi dalam exemption clause ni yang dekat hujung-hujung slide, but I don't think it's material for exams, so I chose not to explain. Okay. And that's basically it. Again, I apologize for any discrepancies in the sound. I'm testing out a new system, so to say. But yeah, that's about it. See ya.